Welcome to the Michelle Rempel-Garner podcast.
Hello, fellow patriots. It has been a busy week because Parliament is sitting. Parliament's back in full swing, and here today joining me to discuss everything that's happening and also break down some of the procedural items that have happened this week that impact your life is veteran political strategist, my chief of staff, and somebody who's been working very hard this week too, Sean Schnell. And Sean, you are catching me at the end of the week. It has been quite a week, and you are going to mostly lead the show this week because, man,
you got a lot going on.
We got a lot going on. It was
you in particular had a lot going on, and I think maybe the place to start this week is you, for those that maybe haven't heard, have taken on a new role in this particular parliament as the Conservative Shadow Minister for Citizenship, Immigration, and Refugees. And so maybe for folks that don't really know what that means, before we kind of get into why that has created a busy situation and week for you, what that all entails and how that kind of has come to be.
Sure. So the Conservatives have formed the official opposition, strengthened from the last parliament. We have, I think it's 24 new members of parliament. But in the official opposition, the leader of the opposition tends to name people who essentially act as the chief critic or the shadow minister on various policy files. And immigration is a hot policy file. And so I'm serving in that role right now. But it's not an entirely new role.
I was going to say something that is somewhat familiar to you.
Yeah, because I served in the role from, I guess it would have been late 2015 to late 2019, I think, 4 years. So it's an area of policy that's, familiar to both of us, but the context has really changed. And you know what? It gives me a chance to say all the stuff that I said during those 4 years, I was right. We're already getting into the topic here, but it's a really serious policy issue because the Liberals over the last decade pursued very aggressive, very high immigration levels. And in order to have that type of numbers, you need to have social and economic infrastructure in place to support newcomers, right? Like housing, healthcare, jobs. And it's very clear that the Liberals exceeded that ratio to a huge extent. And, it's one of these areas of public policy where it's fair to nobody, right? Because it's not immigrants' fault for wanting to come to Canada and experience the promise that this country offers. But it is the Liberals' fault for setting immigration levels so high that we now have a housing crisis, a jobs crisis, and a healthcare crisis. So litigating those issues after, 10 years ago raising red flags on, for example, the illegal border crossing crisis at Roxham Road, people illegally crossing the border, having already reached the safety of upstate New York and making asylum claims, lifting visa impositions from countries that never should have had their visa impositions lifted. I could go on and on and on. The low-skilled temporary foreign worker stream, issuing hundreds of thousands of temporary foreign student permits without having housing. So I want to say I was right. I will be saying that. But more importantly, the Liberals need to sharply reduce immigration. And that's something that we'll be pressing them on. And it was busy this week, starting to raise profile on that issue in this parliament.
Yeah, so maybe before we get into what specifically happened this week, let's back up a little bit because we're now a couple of weeks into this session of Parliament. And I think there was a lot of expectation. We're fresh off the heels, really, still of the federal election campaign. There was a lot of promises made, a lot of conversation about what both the ballot question was, but also what the immediate response from Parliament would be in reaction to things like the American tariffs, the conversations around affordability and housing crisis. And like I said, there was a lot of promises that were made. So Parliament has been now sitting for a couple of weeks. And how do you think going into Parliament as it opens up, those expectations are being met? What do you think as far as the conversation has unfolded over the last couple of weeks? Is it rising to the occasion, what we're seeing coming out of Parliament, out of the throne speech, out of the initial legislation that is coming in here? Like, unpack for me a little bit expectation versus reality here.
It's such a great question. And this gives me an opportunity to sort of talk about the behind the scenes tea that I saw this week. So I guess I would answer your question by saying, I think Mark Carney, he thinks like he's the president of the United States in some way, right? Like he's had those stage photo ops, like I'm signing this into law or whatever. I actually think
which is weird, right? It's weird for Canada.
But I think he thinks that it's like he's the executive of some country or some company and just is signing some sort of order and is, telling his employees to make it so. But that's not how Parliament works. There are 3 branches of government for a reason. And he has to figure out how to take some of his initiatives through the legislative branch of Parliament, of government, which is Parliament. So you've watched him over the last couple of weeks manage like he has a majority government, but he doesn't have a majority government. Right. And so you saw this happen this week when he lost a significant vote in Parliament on amending the throne speech. Conservatives won that vote with the support of the other opposition parties. And the other thing is, and I know we're going to talk about this bill in specific because there's a lot of people who have questions about it. Bill C2, this omnibus bill that has some pretty serious concerns about privacy, Canadians' privacy in it. And it's just this dog's breakfast of a bill. And the way that they presented it in the House, it was like, well, this is just going to sail through because we're just going to, whip our caucus and push it through. But it's a minority parliament. And there's been a lot of signs that there's a disconnect between how Mark Carney is governing and how Parliament is going to function. Mm-hmm. And there was a few articles I know this week that spoke about that, but I've seen it firsthand, which is good. There should be some checks on this government.
Interesting, I think, too, not unexpected, I guess. You're starting to see a bit of the backpedaling and revisionist history where it is really trying to lower expectations and lower the bar for what success looks like here now, too, because there were some pretty grand claims and promises, like I said, coming out of the election. And immediately now it has been like, oh, well, we need time to do this. And we're the budget, right? We're working on getting sort of our house in order here so that we can get this in place. And that's a usual tactic of the Liberals in particular, is this overpromise on expectation, but when reality sets in, it's reframing what success looks like. 100%. What are you observing as far as the state of the parties, the individual parties as they currently exist? You've got an NDP party that is severely diminished. You've got a Liberal party that has just put in place cabinet, and you're starting to see little leaks and things come out about disgruntled individuals. And then, like you said, you've got an increased seat count with the Conservatives. Like, what's your observations on what the state of play of the various different parties are as Parliament has been in session now?
Where to start? Let's start with the NDP, New Democrats. So they were reduced down to 7 seats, so they don't have official party status. And for people who might not understand what that means, is that they've lost a lot of privileges that they previously had in the House of Commons. Primarily the funding you would get from the House of Commons as an official party for things like research staff, even space in the lobby behind the House of Commons chamber. But most importantly, they've lost spots on parliamentary committees, which means that they don't have a spot to make interventions on committees, amend legislation at the committee stage, or vote. So that's a big loss. Oh, also they don't have guaranteed spots in debate in the same way that they did before, or question period in the same way that they did before. So that's a big loss of profile for the New Democrats. But also when you don't have official party status and they're in a leadership race right now, you have to look at the party. They're 7 individual members. It's almost like they're 7 independent members of parliament.
Right.
And, this has been reported on. There's already a faction, 2 factions within their existing caucus. There's people there's a few of them that some of them are calling the establishment, if you can believe that, for the NDP. Then there's these others. I think one of them is probably going to run for leadership. So they're not functioning like a cohesive unit right now, except when they are. And what's interesting is in this first week, and I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the future, they've, how to put this, I think a few of them realize that the path of just supporting the Liberals every single time, it's not going to continue to pay off for them, because it decimated them in the last election.
Right,
I'll just close with this. So they've lost Jagmeet Singh, the leader, who didn't have as much of a presence in the House of Commons last time. But I think the key dynamic changer, outside of losing, over half their caucus, is that they lost Peter Julian. He was a MP from the Vancouver area who acted as their House leader. And he really sort of ruled the party quite a bit. He had a lot of influence in negotiating what the party would do vis-a-vis the Liberals and whipping the caucus. He's gone now. And I think having him gone is, the people that are left, they're starting to evaluate some of the decisions on whether they're not going to support the Liberals in a different light. Now, it's early days. Who knows what's going to happen? Who knows if they're just trying to create leverage, and at the end of the day, they're just going to support the Liberals no matter what. But that's been an interesting dynamic. I know you have some questions about the Liberal Party, though.
Yeah, so this was interesting because one of the things that I think the Liberals could count as somewhat of a success coming out of the last parliament, right up until about when Justin Trudeau resigned, was their caucus was pretty tight-lipped on unity and disgruntled individuals and those factions and things that you're talking about. And we all know, like, those things exist within politics and within caucus, but the Liberals never really led on or let it show. And what I have found interesting is in the first couple of weeks here, in the early days, that has not been the case out of this Liberal caucus. There's been several articles that have been written that there are unnamed sources, and they've talked to anonymous MPs where there is kind of hurt feelings and frustrations, even to the point that there's already speculation about senior caucus members that will resign in the coming months, and they're not happy with all sorts of things, cabinet policy, direction, communication style, you name it. It's kind of like everything is sort of leaking out. And I was curious to hear your take on, as somebody who has sat across the aisle from these guys for quite some time and observed them up close, what your take on both these reports of disunity, but just also your observations on how they're functioning as a unit.
What a great question. And I want to talk about this so much, like there's so much tea. Okay. So you're absolutely right. Let's start with the comment that you made about it is unprecedented for the Liberal Party in recent history to have members of Parliament complain about the government right at the start of Parliament. That has not happened before. This is new. Like you said, the only time we really saw caucus leaks out of the Liberal Party, and there should have been caucus leaks before, like they pushed forward a lot of crappy legislation. I digress. But the only time we really saw it before was around the Justin Trudeau ouster, when the writing was on the wall and there had been some snowballing, but at the end of a parliament, right? Not at the beginning of it. So here's what I observed happening. So there's several tranches of sort of caucus rewards for the Liberals being in government. The first is cabinet positions. The second is parliamentary secretary positions. These are parliamentary secretaries. They're not cabinet ministers, but they're actually, government appointed roles where they're a bit of a salary top up. You have sort of a lead position in committees. You're helping the minister take stuff through the House of Commons. You're there answering questions in question period when the minister can't get there. So there's some responsibility to it. Then there's committee chairs, and then there's the Speaker of the House of Commons, in theory. So what Carney came out and he appointed a cabinet, but he turfed some of the people that he put into cabinet right after he became leader, right? So who was it that was the key example of that? Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, right?
Yeah.
You saw there was a huge article from him, and I'm going to talk about the tone about this in a second, but he said, what was the word that he used, Sean? It was something like, I feel so disrespected. I wasn't put back into cabinet. But he actually dropped a bunch of people that he put into cabinet, and then they never served. So I'm thinking specifically about Ariel Kayabaga. Carney put her in as House leader. The House wasn't sitting, and then he immediately dropped her afterwards. And that I thought was really curious. I have my thoughts about why he did that, but out of respect for Ariel, I don't want to say that, but I think we all know what happened there, right? And I think that's just disgusting. So he pissed some people off there, but then he also, I think when he was running for leadership, this is Mark Carney, I think he probably gave a wink and a nod to some of these big community organizers that they were going to get into cabinet, and they didn't. Then you have people who've been sitting and dutifully carrying water for Trudeau and then for Carney, and I think that they expected something, and there wasn't a lot of promotion. So a lot of disgruntled people. And I'll just close with this, like going back to what I said about Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, I feel disrespected. One of the things you have to learn as a politician, an elected official, particularly in federal office, I'm here in Ottawa today. There's all of these pressures to make you think that you're everything except what you are, which is a servant to the people in your riding, right? The people of Calgary Nose Hill pay my salary. I am accountable to them. I am responsive to them. My primary responsibility is to be the member of Parliament for Calgary Nose Hill. And there has to be an amount of humility that is always internalized when you're making decisions. Could I get a government role? Sure. Could I get this? Could I get that? But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Your primary responsibility is member of Parliament for X riding. So to say like, oh, I feel disrespectful or disrespected and all this stuff, it's like, if you have a cabinet appointment or not, your primary job doesn't change, right? So you can't let those ego hurting feelings get in the way of doing your job. And those caucus leaks, Sean, that you talked about, to me, it tells me that the Liberal caucus has not internalized that lesson, that they think that they're entitled to some things. And that is going to cause Mark Carney a world of hurt and a world of problems, because a group of disgruntled caucus that has not been managed by the PMO in any way, shape, or form. You saw that dismissive hand gesture that Carney gave to Melanie Joly. That is not going to get legislation through the House of Commons. There will be massive problems for him with that.
Well, and that I think comes to sort of the question I was going to ask, or maybe like the context around why this matters, because it's not just about like kind of salacious rumors or things that are coming out of Ottawa. It talks about the effectiveness of government, and we've seen examples of this in history at other levels of government and provincial governments. When there is caucus disunity and dysfunction, things don't get done. They can't pass legislation. They can't advance policy initiatives. They can't communicate effectively on issues. And so that's the sort of why does this matter? It's not just about sort of the gossip stories or opinion pieces that are being written. It actually functionally has an impact on how effective Parliament is. And that's why it matters. So I think that's a big concern. Like you said, at the front end of the Parliament, especially, it's concerning. And these are not a bunch of new individuals that are rookies. There are some of them, but a lot of these folks have been around the block several times, and they're sophisticated political operatives within their caucus. And so causing disruption and disunity is something that they are very capable of doing.
No, and okay, so let's like extend this conversation out to passing legislation through the House of Commons. If you have an NDP that's flexing its muscles, you have like a strengthened official opposition with 24 new members. We have said, we're going to work with the government where it makes sense to work with the government, but we're a talented team and we've grown the team. And Carney now has a disgruntled, angry caucus. He can't put forward pieces of legislation like Bill C2, right? So we're going to get into it, but this is like just, again, this dog's breakfast piece of legislation that has all sorts of poison pills in it. That is the type of, like, if you're going to take that approach as a PMO, as a prime minister, you're going to burn capital with the voting public and with your caucus, who you're going to ask to ram it through. But he doesn't have a majority. So he's got all of these issues. He's got, an opposition where the dynamics have changed. He doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons, and he's got a disgruntled caucus. So this is just like, I shouldn't be shocked, because he's a Green rookie prime minister. You're absolutely right. Like, this speaks to me, like a dysfunctional government, and for it to be happening this early, look, this narrative, I think you and I are going to do a podcast in 6 months to a year and be like, remember when we did that podcast and we talked about him having a disgruntled caucus and not thinking about House operations properly? I think that's going to be a big problem for him. And if I know that we have some folks from like the different special interest groups and stuff that listen to this podcast, if I was advising anybody right now who's wanting to get something through government, this is a big problem for Carney, and it's something that people are going to have to really think about for sure. And it's not like, again, I want to be very clear, like, I don't get the sense that the opposition, we're going to be obstructionist for the sake of being obstructionist. But when the government is presenting stuff that can't be supported and they're not willing to think about the operating context, it's going to be a problem for sure for Mark Carney.
One last question kind of on process and where things stand before we unpack some of the legislation and what's happened in the last week here that you've been alluding to here. So one other thing that stood out to me that was interesting, that kind of deviated from historical norms, was the fact that the Prime Minister put out a single mandate letter to cabinet as opposed to these individual mandate letters. And I was curious what your take on that was, either why or what the thought process was there, and what you thought of what was in there, but also what wasn't in there. There was a couple things in particular that stood out.
Maybe I'll start with explaining to people who might not know what a cabinet mandate letter is.
Yeah.
So it's essentially a job description with clear deliverables, right? So, in any job, if you're working for someone, you've got a list of things that you're responsible for, that you're getting paid to do, right? Or if you're in consulting, you've got a consulting contract with a client where it's like, you're going to deliver X, Y, and Z. Good, right? So in the past, cabinet ministers, and these have been made public, they have mandate letters, which are essentially job descriptions. You will deliver X, Y, and Z policy or regulation change or whatever in X period of time. And I think it was a way for the PMO to keep their ministers accountable, to give stakeholders some understanding of implementation priorities. But Carney did the opposite. He decided to just put out, some people online are saying like it felt like it was written by, Chat GPT or AI, these very high level set of principles. What could that mean? I think it shows a lack of transparency in the government. But more importantly, it raises questions on whether he knows what he's going to offload to his ministers. It could suggest another bottlenecked PMO. I think it's an uncertainty element for some people and some businesses that are looking for clarity on who's holding the pen, especially when he's got ministers that have the same title, right? Like, who's the Minister of Trade functionally, right? You've got Dominic LeBlanc has some elements of that. There's a few other ministers too, and it's not clear. So I think that's problematic because nobody knows who's holding the pen on certain issues. And again, it goes back to that, what you said earlier. I think it's just, this feels like a green government that, like, it doesn't know what it's doing. And that doesn't bode well for getting quick action on some of these issues that they way overpromised during the election.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. So again, these things sort of in isolation maybe don't mean much, but when you put them together, you start to get a picture of how this government is functioning in its early days. So no budget, these single mandate letters, big giant omnibus legislation, which I know we're going to get into, and it sort of it looks like a prime minister and a government that really doesn't have a lot of clue as to what they're doing as far as the function of Parliament and how some of this process typically unfolds, and a lack of accountability or a lack of desire to have accountability. So you talked about the ministerial mandate letters as being a way for the government or the prime minister to hold its ministers accountable, but also for Canadians and voters to hold those ministers and the government accountable as well too. A clear outline of objectives and timelines. And so this high level piece, that this letter that talks about a few priorities, nothing really surprising. A lot of it was talked about during the campaign, but really light on specifics, really light on timelines. Same thing with the fact that there's no budget. So it begins to raise this question of, well, how transparent, how accountable does this prime minister and this government really want to be? And then when you have a single mandate letter, you can only put so much into it. And so one of the big glaring omissions from it was around the issue of crime, and that was a big thing that had come up during the campaign. I know we certainly heard it on the doors in our community, and people did across the country. And so I don't know if it was just simply an oversight, or if it truly isn't one of their priorities, which would be a huge mistake considering it's such a big issue. But again, it really doesn't give a lot of confidence that this is either a government that's being transparent, accountable, or really interested in doing things in an efficient, effective way to show Canadians we're serious about a variety of important issues.
1,000%. And, one thing that I guess this would be a nice bridge into C2, and the fact that this wasn't a bill that it could have been a bill that dealt with some of the big crime issues. But okay, that'll be the next thing we talk about. I just want to say he also made two really interesting choices for key positions that usher legislation or usher a legislative agenda through the House of Commons. And that's the government House leader and the chief government whip. So your chief government House leader, somebody who strategically thinks about how to take legislation through the House of Commons and would be, thinking about operational strategy when composing bills and thinking about timing and, House approach. And then your chief government whip is the one who's liaising with the caucus to make sure that they're voting such that the legislation passes, right? And both of those people, like Steve McKinnon is the House. It is Steve McKinnon, right? I think.
Yeah, House leader, right? Yeah.
Steve's served in different roles before. I'm not sure he's got the chops to manage this Parliament. It'll be interesting to see how that goes from a tactical perspective. And then the second thing is Mark Gerritsen as a choice of whip is like, I was, because I know, my podcast listeners will be like, what? But you talk to people across the aisle and you have relations, and like Mark's not really well liked in his caucus. And as a whip, you're spending a lot of political capital. You have to be making those relationships, building trust with your colleagues, because you're asking them to carry the government's water in a lot of situations. And I'm not sure Mark's got the grace to do that. Like he's exercised some judgment issues on Twitter and stuff before he's had to, issue retractions. And, Mark would typically in the past be somebody the whip would have to call and be like, hey, bud, like, maybe you don't do that. And now you've got this caucus where they're already leaking things. And no mandate letters, as you said. So it's this lack of direction. So the caucus isn't going to know what's happening either. It's not just about accountability to the public. It's like the caucus is going to be going, okay, well, who's working on what? And wait, the whip, Mark Gerritsen's phoning me and asking me to do something, and I don't know what's going on here. And I just see all sorts of problems brewing. And it's Mark Carney is not a seasoned parliamentarian. He wouldn't understand these subtleties. And he's structured his cabinet. And that's the other thing. He hired this chief of staff who, you know, I'm not sure that his resume suggests that he understands these subtleties either. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. But, you know, if you want to go back, we can bridge into the lack of crime legislation and crime initiatives right off the bat, too.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that because, like you said, it has been a heavy week. There's been a lot that has gone on here. So Parliament has been sitting now for a couple of weeks, and the government has started to introduce legislation. So we've talked about it a couple of times. We've mentioned C2, and this is one of the big omnibus pieces of legislation that was introduced this week. So maybe just for some context, if you want to give a bit of a high level on sort of what happened this week, what this legislation is, and then I've got some questions on process and what people can expect, but let's maybe unpack it first.
So C2 has received, wait, I'm going to back up. The response to C2 feels the same. It's like Groundhog Day for the response to C63 in the last parliament. This was the so-called online harms bill. And it was just this big steaming pile that like virtually every stakeholder group across political stripe opposed, because it was this, you know, just omnibus mushed up bill that had like one particular supportable provision. So in C63, there were some clauses that would have strengthened reporting requirements for child pornography. But then this, like, you know, these thought crime provisions and this massive censorship bureaucracy. And it was just like, just this terrible bill. And they didn't learn from that scenario. They went right into Bill C2, which is, it's not exactly the same content, but it's the same sort of, there's a few provisions in the bill around border security and potentially immigration that with some amendments could be supportable. Like, because like, listen, the Liberals have created, this is their mess. It's an open, porous border, you know, immigration system that's broken. There's this fentanyl crisis that's happening, and it's largely due to bad Liberal policy. But, you know, as a legislator, I want to help fix that. But then they ram these poison pills into this bill, like massive snooping provisions. You know, I spent the evening the other night after it was tabled looking through this. I could, you know, spend an entire podcast, maybe should in the future, on C2. But for this week, I'll just say, like, you know, Mark Carney came out and said, well, I'm not going to play legislative games. And then this bill came out. I am hoping, Sean, that like this is just C2 is just the product of a green prime minister, a green chief of staff, a green cabinet, and a super green, I think it's a justice minister, public safety, Gurian and Sangre. Yeah. He green. I think that some of these things that they put into this bill were they've been sitting on the shelf in the department for a while. And you know, you got some bureaucrats that are like waiting for an opportunity to put it in, and then they just had the right combination of weak ministers to dump it into a bill. But like, why table it this way? Why not try and get a quick win in Parliament, knowing the situation with some of these provisions that, you know, Canadians could have gotten behind? It just, to me, like, if I was wearing a Liberal strategist hat, it seems like such a wasted opportunity for the government to get some wins on issues that Conservatives are typically strong on. Like, it's going to be tough to communicate why they did this. I've seen groups that typically would support the Liberals on certain issues coming out and panning this bill. So that doesn't bode well for them. So I'll have more to say on the bill in coming weeks. I gave a speech in the House of Commons on it, but just like tactically, it just seemed really dumb to me. I don't know why they did this.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things you mentioned is that it looks like a bunch of random things kind of put together, and it really does read that way. It doesn't even, it's not even cohesive. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Even the order, like as you're reading through the bill, it jumps around all over the place. It does. It feels like it's 4 or 5 bills kind of piecemealed together that none of them are all that good. And so I think that is an interesting question of why. And interesting to see how the Liberals and the government try to spin this now as they've come out. They haven't really seemed to have a cohesive message yet on it. They
No. Very
spinning
the opposite.
Yeah. What's your observation on that? Because like you said, you've got this Green Justice Minister. You as the critic are observing this new immigration minister. So,
she's weak. Oh man. Okay, let's park Lena Diab for let's park her for a second.
Yeah.
But I on this bill, I just want to take a minute and talk about the lack of material provisions that should have been in a bill to address. The bill is there. I think that they're trying to communicate it. It's ostensibly to fight the fentanyl problem in Canada. Okay. There might be a couple of things in there that Parliament should study that make sense. Certainly not the snooping provisions and stuff like that. I digress. But what's missing in there are some of the key irritants that are causing this problem. So the fact that the Liberals softened bail requirements, they should have repealed that right off the bat. That would have, I think, done more for crime in this country than anything. And that's a huge lost opportunity. The second thing is the Liberals essentially softened penalties for crimes like major drug production, right? They should have been increasing penalties. They've stolen so much conservative platform. They should have stolen Pierre Poilievre's platform on increasing penalties for drug production and distribution. And the third thing that I thought was lacking was it doesn't do anything for people who are caught in the throes of addiction right now. And there's been a lot of conversation in the last couple of months about compassionate measures for people who are in the throes of addiction, like for life-saving measures for people who have lost the agency to intervene for themselves. They could have put that in there. And, instead they focused on this other stuff that was just wild. But should we talk immigration?
Yeah, I was going to say, let's unpack a little bit of that, because there has been some pretty significant media pushback on this. And you mentioned your speech, which people should go and listen to as well. But one of the initial pushbacks on this bill that you talked about and the media have talked about is the questions and concerns related to Canadians' individual civil liberties and the concerns over privacy that are, like you said, embedded within this bill that really don't seem to have anything to do with what they said this bill was about, border security.
So again, this is one of those things where the bill is so encompassing. Our Conservative caucus right now, we're doing more research on that type. We in debate this week, we raised concerns about that. The bill's so fresh, Sean, that, this is what I'm going to be doing over the weekend. But what we should, maybe next week or, soon do a full session of this podcast to unpack those concerns, because I share those concerns. I think we just need a little bit more time to unpack them fully. I'm getting so many emails and calls from people, and I know you are too, through our shared inbox on that issue. So maybe we could do that next week. But suffice to say, the message is coming through loud and clear. We know that there's problems with this, and people, should watch the speech on that.
Yeah, and I mean, for good reason. I mean, this government does not have a good track record as it relates to legislation and policy.
That's a great point.
As it relates to protecting Canadian civil liberties. And so I think people should be concerned and skeptical whenever that alarm or flag is raised with legislation. So I think people are interested about it. I think that's a great idea to unpack that some more.
It's a good reminder to tell people to click auto download and subscribe to this podcast so they can get all the information on stuff like this. And we'll talk about C2 in more detail in the coming week.
So just quickly, maybe before we wrap up here, give people a bit of.
No, I want to talk about immigration.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
We got to talk about this.
Go ahead.
We're recording this on Friday afternoon, and this is going to be like a therapy session for me. Wow, did he ever pick a weak immigration minister? Wow. I mean, you and I actually haven't, it's been such a busy week. You and I actually haven't talked about this.
No,
so I'm going to ask you.
I've really only watched your exchanges with her in the house.
So you and I have not talked at length since, we've had a couple of question periods this week. So I'll just ask you here live, like, what did you think? And let's see if we had the same thoughts.
Oh, ridiculous. A minister that seems totally uninformed and unprepared to answer what should be fairly basic questions about the portfolio that she's in charge of here. And I think the moment that, and again, it's on your social media, and I encourage people to go and watch it, is when you stood up in the House this week and asked her a specific question about numbers. And maybe I'll let you kind of frame the question and the conversation and the answer that you got back, because it was actually crazy, mind-boggling.
It was crazy. So this week, the topic we didn't even touch on yet, but let's talk about it in this context. The job numbers that came out today, we're recording this on Friday, 7% unemployment.
Yeah.
Canadian students returning to school in the fall are facing 20% unemployment. So 1 in 5 Canadian students are facing unemployment. And the question that I asked her was, we were doing some statistics research on the IRCC, the immigration website, that showed that the government issued over 500,000 temporary foreign work permits last year. So that's a lot, right? Like that's a city. It's a city size worth of temporary work permits, and then you've got this job crisis that is happening. And so I asked her. I said, you've got this. Essentially, the question was, you've got this job crisis happening. Why are you issuing? Like, why did you issue? No, it wasn't temporary. It was student visas, right? That was the answer. Yes, it was student visas. Yeah. Because we asked about both this week. This specific question, I asked her, same thing. It was 500,000 student visas that they issued last year. And I said, why? Because people who come to Canada on visas to be students, they're entitled to work in Canada. So they're competing with Canadian students for jobs. Student visas. And I was looking at the departmental data on this, and I stood up and asked her, why? Why did you issue so many work permits? You said you were going to cap it. You blew past the cap. Why did you do this? And she stood up and she accused me of spreading misinformation. And I actually had my earpiece in, Sean. I had my earpiece in, and I said to my colleagues, I'm like, did she just say that was misinformation? I'm like, I got it on the website. And they're like, what? So this is all happening so fast. And I had a rebuttal question in question period. So the only question that sprang to mind in this ridiculousness was, okay, well, I got this off of your website. So if these numbers aren't right, what are they? What are the numbers? And, her response was so weak. And this is not, as a new minister, this is not rocket science. This is the top issue that's in the newspaper every day. I mean, if I wanted to come up with some tricky questions for her, I could do that. But this is not, this is basic. I thought I was being nice to her, frankly. This is something she should have been able to answer. And wow. So if she's this weak, Sean, my concern was I had asked her about temporary foreign workers earlier in the week. Then I asked her about student visas the other day. And if she's this week on basic stuff like that, and they're blowing through caps that they made, how can we have any trust in this government? I don't know. Do you think they're going to shuffle her? That was a pretty weak. That was one of the weakest performance I have seen my share of immigration ministers in my time in opposition. That was probably the weakest I've ever seen.
I guarantee you they had a conversation about it this week. I don't know that they could shuffle her out anytime soon, but there's certainly a conversation. It's
pretty bad. You know what the best was? Can I say this? It wasn't the best. Yeah. Actually, Mark Miller, if you're listening to this, in all seriousness, Mark Miller was in her shot behind her. They've got Mark Miller, the former immigration minister, sitting right behind her. And can you imagine being Mark Miller and listening to this? That must have been tough, like listening to that. But I don't know. I Sean, I think she's so bad. Like it's almost like, well, it's pretty bad. Like, come on.
Yeah,
Can we
I mean,
actually keep her around?
we'll have to see what they do here. The one thing that I think has been becoming apparent as you watch QP and you watch the House proceedings, they have a narrow group of individuals that they're letting communicate on issues, and she very quickly may find herself not on that list to be able to
But I
talk
mean,
and get up.
okay.
But
Look, if
at
they're going
some
to pull
point,
the
at some point, you
immigration,
can't hide.
if they're going to exactly like if they're going to pull the immigration minister, like freshly appointed, off of the immigration file in question period, I mean, that means she's going to be shuffled, right? Like, I don't know. I cannot believe they put her in that role. She just doesn't. Wow, and it's such a core file right now. It's just something that it's so delicate. It has to be managed with grace and honesty, right, and courage, and smarts, and oh, I'm not going to lay up though. So if anyone's watching is like wondering if I'm going to use the mercy rule, of course not.
No, nor should you. I mean, this is their mess that they've created.
Exactly. And it's not for politics. It's like, this is one of the key issues facing the country right now. And like, and I'm sorry. So Lena, it's Lena, right? If she's listening to this, we're not letting up. You're not going to get a free ride here. And you're up against one of the, like most seasoned veterans on the other side of the bench. We're going to be holding her to account on this file on behalf of Canadians and immigrants. One of the lines that I want to stress to people, and I know Canadians feel this way. It's not somebody's fault for wanting to come to Canada and have a better life. It is the Liberals' fault for messing up the immigration program to a point where when they knew we didn't have enough houses, they knew we didn't have enough healthcare, they knew we didn't have enough jobs. And then they juiced policies that made the jobs crisis work, like the energy cap, inflation, like this is a therapeutic grant. But they did that. They created this mess. And then they said, come on. And, it creates this tension in the country that, to me, like that is such a Liberal failing. And then they put
tension that they created. Because they demonized you and anybody that dared to question or oppose any of their policies that they were putting in place. So not only did they create the mess, they created the division by demonizing those on the other side that would dare to question their approach to this. And now they've come out and said, oh yeah, well actually this approach hasn't worked, as if they weren't the ones that did it. They've not really admitted that they're the ones that screwed the system up, but they've just said, yeah, they have to take a different approach.
They have to. Like,
this is how they talk out of both sides of their mouths.
Of course they do, but they have to say we were wrong and we have to fix it. That is a start. They have to start from that starting point, right? And also like, the other reason, I'll just say this. The other reason why having a weak minister in that file is so bad is that, like, and not having a mandate letter is there has to be system fixes, like operational system fixes within the Department of Immigration that is going to take political will and management skill and systems knowledge, right? There is like, Sean, for them to say we're going to issue this many X many student permits, okay? That's a pretty hard number. It's like, okay, and that's something that's easy to manage too. We're gonna issue X number of student permits. Okay, so it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, when we get to that, we stop, right? How did they issue so much more? Like for me, if I was a minister, like there would be a deputy minister, ADM level meeting going, this is fixed this week. Now, I don't care how it's done. Well, I do care how it's done, but I don't want to hear that it's not going to be done. It will be done. And I just, like, from her responses in question period this week, I don't think that she doesn't have the chops to read off a page. Never mind have a conversation like that. And I know there are people.
Go ahead.
Cathartic rant. I know there are people in that department that want to see change, right? But you need to have a minister who's like giving you air cover, right? And breaking.
Well, and that was what I was going to say. Yeah. That's what I was going to say is there's the policy, there's the political will, there's the actual implementation, but there's also the ability to effectively communicate, to give the space to actually get this done.
Yes.
And that is as necessary a skill set as all of the rest of that.
100%.
If you cannot effectively communicate why you're doing what you're doing, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it, because like there are a million different lobbyists and stakeholders and organizations and industries that are pulling and pushing in different directions on
they're
this.
not pulling in different directions, they're saying more. I mean, you and I dealt with this when we were in the immigration portfolio before. Endless stakeholder meetings telling me why they needed the opposition to push for more. Okay, but the questions don't. The questions on how don't change. Do we have enough houses? Do we have enough jobs? Do we have enough healthcare? Do we have enough education capacity? Do we have enough daycare capacity? Like all of the social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. Like you can't just like take one bead of input on immigration levels and not be thinking holistically. And that is a skill that the Liberal government lost long ago. They don't have the courage to manage this with grace and with honesty about those questions. And she just, okay, now you're being my therapist. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to say,
like it's just a rant.
So now as we look as kind of wrap up here, what are we going to see over the next week or two in Parliament? What can we expect for folks that are maybe unfamiliar with the parliamentary process? We've had the throne speech, we've got legislation that's been introduced. What can we expect to see over the next couple of weeks? Sure.
So the key part that there will be these bills. The government introduced a bill today. We'll get more information from their House leader on how long Parliament's going to sit, what their legislative schedule is, if there's going to be, any desire to be sitting over the summer. I expect we'll get that information probably next week. But the key things that people should be watching for is something, and the key process will be the estimates process, the business of supply. So essentially the government, putting it simply, has to get approval from Parliament to keep spending money. And there's a series of steps that have to happen and votes that have to happen in Parliament. And the government has to find support from opposition parties for different types of spending. You can expect to see, as part of this process, something called opposition days or supply days, where the opposition parties control the debate and the topic of debate in the House of Commons. So Conservatives will have a few of those days. And you can expect motions from us that relate to, the inadequacy of the government focusing on inflationary spending and the impact that has on Canadians, but also all of these other issues too: crime, trade, immigration. Those topics will come up in debate in one way or another. There's a process as well called the Committee of the Whole. It relates to all of the things I just talked about without getting into all the technical specificity. But essentially what that is we'll have ministers in front of the House of Commons for 2 hours at a time in almost like a question period like format, but quicker. We have the immigration minister on Monday night. So I'll be busy prepping all weekend for that. In fact, I'm going to get back to that as soon as we're done this podcast. It's going to be a fun Friday night, Sean, of
sounds like it.
Prepping and reading legislation. But there's going to be a lot of action over the next few weeks. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the summer committees as well. You wanted me to mention that, I think, too. So parliamentary committees, the process for reconstituting committees has started, but it's not finished. So the first process, there's a committee that the acronym is PROC. It's the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. I think that's been struck. From there, the other committees essentially are formed. I'm not sure where we're at right now in terms of constituting those committees, but I expect to get more details about that early in the week next week. I'd love our committee to sit. I think that there's a lot to talk about. So busy few weeks for sure, and maybe beyond.
Lots on the go, that's for sure. So we've got a lot to talk about with people here over the next couple of weeks.
We do. So what do they need to do?
people need to make sure that they are subscribed both to your Substack, which the link will be in the description, but you can also make sure that your podcast is set for auto download wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm going to get back to work. Well, this is work. We're telling people what we're doing, but I'm going to read legislation and prep for committee of the whole and prep for this and prep for that.
And we'll be back soon to chat with folks about what is going on.
Working hard for you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. If you want even more political news, subscribe at michellerempelgarner.substack.com. And if you like what you hear, be sure to share this podcast.